I still remember the exact sound of that conference room door closing behind me. It wasn't a slam. It was slow, deliberate, the kind of sound that tells you something irreversible is about to happen. The kind of sound you replay in your mind at 3 in the morning for months afterward, wondering if there was anything you could have said, anything you could have done differently, any version of that Tuesday in March where you walk out of that room still employed, still respected, still whole. It was March 14th, 2017, a Tuesday. I know because I'd packed my lunch that morning, leftover pasta from Sunday, a habit I'd built to save money since moving to New York 2 years before. I remember setting it in the office refrigerator on the 31st floor of a glass tower on Park Avenue, thinking I'd eat at my desk during lunch the way I always did. I never touched that food again. The meeting was called without warning. No email the night before. No calendar invite. Just Karen, the executive assistant, appearing at my cubicle at 9:47 in the morning with a look on her face I couldn't quite read, somewhere between pity and discomfort, telling me that Richard Hollis, our senior vice president of operations, wanted to see me immediately, along with someone from HR. HR. That word alone should have told me everything. I walked down that corridor in slow motion, or at least it felt that way, past the rows of monitors, past the open kitchen area where 2 colleagues glanced up and then looked away too quickly. The Manhattan skyline stretched behind the floor-to-ceiling windows, gray and enormous, the way New York looks in early March when the winter hasn't quite decided to let go. I noticed the East River in the distance, thin and silver, completely indifferent to what was about to happen to me. When I entered the room, Richard was already seated. Beside him sat Donna Marsh from Human Resources, a folder thick with papers resting in front of her. Neither of them smiled. Neither of them offered me a seat right away. That pause, those 3 or 4 seconds where I just stood there, felt like the longest of my life. Then Richard looked at me with something I can only describe as controlled fury and said, "Marcus, we've identified a serious financial discrepancy, one that traces directly back to you. We're terminating your employment, effective immediately." The room didn't spin. I wish it had. Instead, everything became hyper-clear, hyper-sharp, the way your senses flood with detail when your brain understands that something catastrophic is happening but your mouth hasn't caught up yet. "I'm sorry." "What?" Those were the only words I managed. 3 words, and they weren't nearly enough. My name is Marcus Webb, and in March of 2017, I was 31 years old and living what I genuinely believed was the beginning of the life I'd always worked toward. I grew up in Philadelphia, in a row house in West Philly, in a family that never had much but always had expectations. My mother worked as a medical billing specialist. My father drove trucks for a freight company until his back gave out. They both believed in 2 things with religious certainty: education and keeping your word. Those were the currencies of our household. Everything else was negotiable. I'd put myself through Temple University on a combination of academic scholarships, Pell Grants, and weekend shifts at a UPS distribution center. I graduated with a degree in finance and a determination that felt almost physical, dense like something I carried inside my chest. I spent 3 years at a mid-size accounting firm in Philadelphia, built my skills, built my reputation, and then in the winter of 2015, I got the call that changed everything. A firm called Hargrove and Finch Capital Advisors was expanding their operations team in New York. A recruiter had found my profile. They were offering a position as a senior financial analyst. Real money, real responsibility, real Manhattan. I took it without hesitation. My first 6 months in New York nearly broke me. I was renting a small room in a shared apartment in Astoria, Queens. 3 roommates, 1 bathroom, a kitchen that smelled permanently of someone else's cooking. Every morning, I took the N train from Astoria Ditmars Boulevard, rattling underground through the tunnel beneath the East River, crowded into a subway car with hundreds of strangers, emerging at 57th Street and walking the 8 blocks to the Park Avenue office tower, in whatever weather New York decided to throw at me that day. Rain, wind, cold that cut through your coat like it had a personal vendetta. But I loved it. Genuinely, stubbornly loved it. I loved the pace of the city. I loved walking through Midtown at 8 in the morning when the streets were already electric with movement, the food carts steaming on the corners, the yellow cabs cutting between buses, the towers of glass and steel catching the early light. I loved being part of something enormous and indifferent, because in that indifference there was also freedom. Nobody in New York cared where you came from. They only watched where you were going. At Hargrove and Finch, I had built a reputation over 2 years that I was genuinely proud of. My supervisor at the time, a sharp woman named Patricia Anand, had written in my last performance review that I was meticulous, dependable, and one of the most detail-oriented analysts on the team. I had never missed a deadline. I had never submitted a report with an error that wasn't caught and corrected by me before anyone else saw it. I worked late. I came in early. I cared. Maybe too much in retrospect. I was 2 months away from a performance review that was expected to come with a promotion. Associate Director of Financial Operations. I'd been told informally, carefully, the way companies tell you things before they're official. I had started quietly imagining what that meant. A raise that would let me move out of Astoria. Maybe find a studio apartment in Brooklyn or the upper Manhattan neighborhoods I walked through on weekends. I was 2 months away from all of that when Karen appeared at my cubicle and everything stopped. The accusation itself was delivered with a kind of cold, corporate precision that made it almost harder to process. Richard Hollis, a man I had spoken to perhaps 40 times in 2 years, always briefly, always in the context of meetings or hallway exchanges, laid it out like a prepared statement. Donna from HR sat beside him, her expression professionally neutral, the folder in front of her a prop in a performance that had clearly been rehearsed. The claim was this: a client account, a significant one, belonging to a hedge fund called Meridian Crest Partners, had experienced what Richard called a catastrophic data entry error that had resulted in a miscalculation of their quarterly portfolio exposure. The error, he said, had been traced to a report I had submitted in January, a report that Meridian Crest's own financial team had been working from for 6 weeks before catching the discrepancy. By the time it was caught, the client had made decisions, actual investment decisions, based on the flawed numbers. The potential liability to Hargrove and Finch was, according to Richard's measured and devastating words, in the range of 8 figures. 8 figures. I sat across from him and felt something strange happen in my chest. Not panic, not yet. Something closer to a profound, disorienting confusion, because I knew that report. I knew every line of it. The January exposure analysis, I said. The one for Meridian Crest? That's correct, Richard said. Richard, I submitted that report on January 19th. I ran it through 2 verification checks. I cross-referenced every figure manually because the data pulls from the Bloomberg terminal had been inconsistent that week. I even flagged that in an internal memo. He didn't blink. The numbers in the final version that was sent to the client do not match your internal verification, Marcus. There are significant discrepancies. I felt the floor tilt slightly. What do you mean the final version? I submitted one version. One. The version the client received is what we're discussing. Then there's something wrong, Richard. Because I'm telling you with complete certainty. Marcus. His voice dropped, and in that single word was a door closing. We've reviewed the file history. The report the client received is attributed to your login credentials. Your name is on it. We've had IT pull the access logs. Donna slid a document across the table. I looked at it. My name, my employee ID, a timestamp from January 19th, 11:42 p.m. Late. Yes, the kind of late I often worked. But those numbers on the page, I stared at them and felt something cold move through me. Because they were wrong. Not slightly wrong. Structurally, foundationally wrong. Numbers that bore a surface resemblance to the correct figures but had been altered in ways that only someone looking closely, someone who already knew what to look for, might initially catch. That is not the report I submitted, I said. My voice was steady. I was surprised by how steady it was. Your login, your timestamp, Richard repeated. I understand what it says. I'm telling you that is not the report I prepared. The silence that followed was the loudest thing I had ever heard in a Manhattan office building. Donna spoke for the first time gently, the way HR people are trained to deliver damage. Marcus, we understand this is difficult to hear, but given the potential liability and the traceability of the error, the company has made the decision to terminate your employment, effective immediately. Security will escort you to your desk to collect your belongings. You'll receive a formal letter by the end of the business day. I looked at both of them. I looked at the document with my name on it, and then I said the only honest thing I could say. You are making a mistake. Nobody responded. They sent a security guard named Tony to walk me back to my desk. Tony was a big, quiet man who had always nodded at me in the mornings when I badged in. He was professional about it, didn't hover, Didn't make it theatrical, but everyone on the floor could see him standing 6 feet away while I emptied my cubicle into a banker's box. Everyone could see the timeline of what that meant. In a Manhattan office of 80-something employees, a banker's box is a message. I kept my eyes down. I folded my Temple University pennant that I'd kept tacked to the cubicle wall for 2 years. I put in my desk plant, a small pothos that had somehow survived New York office air conditioning, my noise-canceling headphones, a framed photo of my parents, all of it now objects in a box, defined by their removal rather than their presence. I could feel the looks. Not all of them were unkind. Some were simply shocked, the way people look when something frightening happens close to them, and they're trying to process what it means for their own safety. But some of the looks were different, calculated, and there was one look from across the open floor plan that I registered but didn't fully understand until much later. Derek Colton, my peer-level colleague, sat at his workstation and watched me with an expression I can only describe now as carefully arranged sympathy. Eyebrows slightly raised, head tilted just a degree, the performance of concern. I caught his eye for a moment and he gave me a small, tight-lipped nod, the kind that says, "Tough break, buddy," without requiring any actual investment. I didn't think about Derek in that moment. I was too focused on keeping myself together. I took the elevator down to the lobby with my banker's box and walked out through the revolving glass doors onto Park Avenue. And the city absorbed me immediately, the way New York absorbs everything, without ceremony, without pause, without any acknowledgement that something significant had just happened to a human being. The wind off the avenue hit me cold and direct. I stood on the sidewalk with my box and just breathed for a moment. The days that followed were a particular kind of hell. Word travels in financial services. New York is a vast city, but certain professional circles within it are surprisingly small. By Thursday of that same week, I got a text from a former colleague at another firm asking, carefully, if I was okay, which told me that the story had already started spreading, and that the version spreading was not flattering to me. By Friday, a recruiter I'd spoken to 6 months earlier had gone conspicuously silent after responding warmly to an email I sent. I filed for unemployment. I sat in the office on 42nd Street, a government building with fluorescent lights and plastic chairs, and filled out forms while across the table a woman in her 50s tried to explain to a clerk that she'd been laid off from a restaurant in the Bronx. Both of us reduced to the same form, the same process. There is a specific humiliation in that, not because of the people around you, but because of the distance between where you thought you were going and where you've ended up. I had worked so hard. That was the thought that kept circling. Not self-pity, exactly. More like bewilderment. Because in Philadelphia, in my parents' house, the operating logic had always been simple. You work hard, you keep your word, you do things right, and outcomes follow. That logic had held for 31 years. And then in 14 minutes in a conference room on the 31st floor of a Park Avenue office building, it had simply stopped being true. At night, in my apartment in Astoria, I could hear the N train running above ground in the distance, that familiar metallic rhythm I'd built my mornings around. I lay in the dark and listened to it and tried to understand what had happened to me. I am not, by nature, someone who gives up easily. My father used to say that stubbornness and determination are the same quality wearing different clothes, and that the only thing separating them is what you're pointing them at. I'd carried that with me my whole life, and in the weeks following my termination, that stubbornness turned itself, slowly but with increasing intensity, toward a single question. What actually happened to that report? I had a personal laptop. I had my personal email, which I'd used occasionally for work, not for sensitive data, but for scheduling, for coordination, for the kind of routine communication that bleeds between professional and personal accounts when you're the kind of person who works at 11 at night. And I had something else, the habit, obsessive and methodical, of saving my work. I kept local copies, not the final submission versions. Those lived on the company servers I no longer had access to, but drafts. Working files, the intermediate versions that showed the process of building a report, the raw data pools, the verification spreadsheets, the cross-reference documents I created to check my own work. I had them all, organized in folders on my personal hard drive by date and client name. On a rainy Saturday in early April, about 3 weeks after I'd been fired, I opened my laptop at the kitchen table in Astoria, my roommates gone for the weekend, The apartment quiet except for rain against the windows and the occasional sound of the elevated N train passing. And I started going through everything. I started with the Meridian Crest file folder. I pulled up the draft I'd been working from in January, and then I opened the document they'd shown me in that conference room. The one Donna had printed, the one with my name on it, the one with the wrong numbers. I placed them side by side. For a long time, I just sat there looking at them. The numbers were different, not random. That was the thing that struck me first. They were different in a way that was internally consistent, as though someone had taken my correct analysis and reworked it, deliberately, applying their own logic to produce a set of figures that looked plausible at a glance, but contained fundamental errors in the exposure calculations. It wasn't sloppiness. You don't make errors in this specific structured pattern by accident. That was the first thing that cracked something open. Then I found the email. It was in a chain I'd almost deleted months ago. One of those long, winding email threads that accumulate dozens of replies and slowly bury the early messages beneath layers of newer ones. I'd been CC'd on it, tangentially, because it related to the Meridian Crest account. Most of the thread was mundane, but buried in the middle, in a reply sent on January 21st, 2 days after I'd submitted my report, was a message from Derek Colton to a senior analyst named Phil Garza. The message was brief, casual, almost too casual for what it contained. Hey Phil, I updated the MC exposure doc to reflect the revised parameters from the 18th. Use the standard template. Let me know if you need anything else before it goes to the client. I read it 3 times. January 21st, 2 days after I submitted. Updated the MC exposure doc. Updated, not reviewed, not forwarded. Updated. My hands weren't shaking. I noticed that. They were completely still, resting on the keyboard, while something in my mind began to quietly, methodically rearrange itself. Revised parameters from the 18th. What parameters? What happened on the 18th? I hadn't been told about any revised parameters. There was nothing in any communication I'd received about revisions to the Meridian Crest exposure analysis after I'd submitted my report. But someone had gone into that document after I submitted it. Someone had updated it, and then it had been sent to the client under my name. Once you see a thing clearly, you cannot unsee it. That's both the gift and the burden of the moment when the truth begins to take shape. I spent the next 4 days building a timeline. I printed everything, emails, draft documents, file metadata I'd saved as screenshots before losing server access. I spread it across the kitchen table in Astoria until the table disappeared entirely beneath paper. And then I started constructing the sequence of events the way you'd build a case. Because that's what it was, I realized. This wasn't a personal project anymore. This was a case. Derek Colton had joined Hargrove and Finch 8 months before I was fired. He'd come in at the same level as me, senior financial analyst, from a boutique firm in New Jersey that had recently downsized. When he arrived, there had been 2 of us up for the same trajectory, the associate director position that had been dangled in front of me as a possibility. 2 analysts, 1 role. I hadn't thought much of it at the time. Competition is a feature of corporate finance, not a bug. I didn't dislike Derek. We'd gotten lunch twice, talked about the job market, complained about the subway together like normal colleagues. He seemed competent, reasonably smart. I hadn't read anything beneath the surface because I hadn't been looking, but now I was looking. I went back through every email interaction I'd had with Derek, and I noticed something that, in the ordinary flow of a busy workday, would never have stood out. Derek had asked me, on January 15th, 4 days before I submitted the Meridian Crest report, if he could take a look at the exposure analysis framework I was using. He said he was working on a similar template for a different client and wanted to see how I'd structured the Bloomberg data pulls. I had shared access to the working folder, without hesitation, because that's how you operate when you trust your colleagues and believe you're all on the same team. He'd had access to my files for 4 days before I submitted. I sat with that for a long time. The rain was gone by then. A Thursday afternoon in April, the Queen's sky pale and washed out. I could hear traffic on 31st Street below the window. Somewhere, a car horn. The city continuing its perpetual oblivious motion. What I believed happened, what the evidence, assembled piece by piece on that kitchen table, strongly suggested, was this. Derek had accessed my working files during those 4 days, understood the structure of the report, and then, after I submitted my final version to the internal server on January 19th, accessed the file again using either his own credentials or an exploit in the system's shared folder permissions, made targeted alterations to the exposure calculations, and allowed the corrupted version to be the one that was transmitted to Meridian Crest. He had then sent that casual, almost invisible email to Phil Garza. I updated the MC exposure doc in a way that, if noticed, could be explained as routine internal review. But Phil Garza, buried under his own workload, had apparently never flagged it, never questioned it. And when the error was eventually discovered and Hargrove and Finch went looking for accountability, the file carried my name, my login, my timestamp on the original submission. I was the clean surface on which someone else had written their mistake. The question was what to do now. I was no longer an employee of the company. I had no access to their servers. The email I'd found was on my personal account. It was real, it was damning, but it was one thread among what must have been thousands inside that office. I needed someone inside that system to look at the full picture. And then I thought of Patricia Anand, my former supervisor, the woman who had written that performance review calling me meticulous and dependable. She'd left Hargrove and Finch 6 months before I was fired, moved to a competing firm in the Rockefeller Center area. We'd stayed in loose contact. I had her cell number. I called her on a Thursday evening at 7 p.m. and told her everything. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, there was a pause. Then, "Marcus, send me everything you have. Every document, every email. Tonight." "Patricia, I don't want to put you in a difficult..." "Tonight," she said again. "I still have relationships at Hargrove, and I know someone in their IT compliance team who owes me a very large professional favor." The truth, when it finally came fast. That surprised me. I had been preparing for a long, grinding battle, for lawyers and formal complaints and depositions that would stretch across months. Instead, it moved with a velocity that felt almost cinematic, almost too clean for something that had been so brutal in its construction. Patricia's contact in IT compliance, a man named Stephen Okafor, someone I never met but to whom I am profoundly and permanently grateful, pulled the full server logs for the Meridian Crest exposure file, not just the surface-level access logs that IT had shown Richard during the original investigation, but the deep logs, every action taken on the file, every edit, every login that had touched it from the day it was created to the day it was sent to the client. What those logs showed was unambiguous. My credentials had last touched the file at 11:42 p.m. on January 19th, consistent with when I submitted my final version. Correct, clean, done. Then at 2:17 a.m. on January 20th, the file had been accessed again, not under my login, under a service account, a shared administrative access credential used for what the system classified as routine internal review. It was the kind of access that wouldn't show up in a standard audit precisely because it was designed to look like automated system activity. But it wasn't automated. Someone had used that credential manually, in the dead of the night, to open my report and alter 11 specific data points in the exposure calculations. Stephen traced the IP address associated with that 2:17 a.m. access. It resolved to a workstation on the 31st floor of the Park Avenue building, Derek Colton's workstation. The formal process moved quickly after that. Patricia communicated the findings to Hargrove and Finch's general counsel, not to Richard Hollis, not to Donna Marsh, but directly to legal, because she understood correctly that the people who had fired me needed to be bypassed by people who had the authority to act on what this information meant for the company's liability. The same liability they'd been so focused on, attributing to me. I got a phone call on a Thursday morning in mid-May. 2 months after my banker's box and the sidewalk on Park Avenue, I was in a coffee shop on Steinway Street in Astoria, a place I'd been going to most mornings since being fired, ordering a single coffee and sitting with my laptop, applying for jobs, maintaining the structure of a routine because structure was all I had left. My phone rang, and it was Hargrove and Finch's general counsel, a woman I'd never spoken to in 2 years of employment there. She spoke for 4 minutes. She told me that their internal investigation had revealed new evidence regarding the Meridian Crest incident. She told me that my termination had been a result of incomplete information. She told me that the company wished to offer me reinstatement, back pay for the 2 months I'd been terminated, and a formal written retraction of all adverse employment documentation in my personnel file. She did not say Derek Colton's name. She did not explain what had happened to him. But I found out later, through Patricia, through the quiet channels of professional networks, that Derek had been terminated and that a referral had been made to the relevant regulatory authorities. Whether anything formal came of that, I don't know. That part of the story belongs to systems larger than me. What I know is what happened to me. I did not go back to Hargrove and Finch. I considered it, and then I decided that some rooms you don't need to walk back into. I took the back pay. I used it to stabilize myself, to breathe for the first time in 2 months. I think about that period of my life often, even now, not with bitterness, or at least not only with bitterness. I think about it because it taught me something that I couldn't have learned any other way. Something that my father's framework of hard work and keeping your word had never prepared me for. That the world is not always just, but it is sometimes correctable. Those are different things. Justice implies a system that works the way it's supposed to. Correctable just means that the truth, if you hold on to it tightly enough, if you refuse to let it be buried under someone else's lie, has a way of eventually surfacing. I had stood in that conference room and said, "You are making a mistake." And I had been right. That mattered. Not because anyone apologized adequately, not because the humiliation of those 2 months was erased. It wasn't, it can't be. But because I had known the truth and I had not let go of it. Not when the security guard walked me to my desk. Not when the banker's box sat on the sidewalk on Park Avenue. Not in the unemployment office on 42nd Street. Not in the dark of my Astoria apartment listening to the N train passing in the distance. Not in any of those long and terrible nights. Some people ask me if I'm angry at Derek. The honest answer is that I've spent less time thinking about Derek than you might expect. What Derek did was deliberate and calculated and wrong, and I hope the consequences of it followed him for a long time. But his choices were his. What I carry from that period is not about him. What I carry is simpler and heavier than anger. It is the knowledge of how quickly a reputation built over years can be dismantled in minutes, by people with authority and incomplete information and no particular interest in slowing down to ask the right questions. It is the knowledge that the systems we trust to protect us, HR processes, corporate investigations, the careful machinery of institutional accountability, can be manipulated by someone patient enough and positioned well enough to exploit their blind spots. And it is also the knowledge, hard-won, real, that none of that is permanent if you refuse to accept it as final. I walked out of that coffee shop on Steinway Street after that phone call and stood on the sidewalk in the May morning, Queens stretching around me in every direction, and I felt something release in my chest. Not triumph, just release. The long exhaled relief of a person who has been carrying something heavy for a very long time and has finally been allowed to set it down. The N train rumbled overhead on its elevated track, heading toward Manhattan, the sound I'd built my mornings around. The city, enormous and indifferent, continuing its motion. I stood there for a while, just breathing. Then I started walking.